Hey everyone, today we're going to be building a very simple one-page digital resume using Laravel. This tutorial is aimed at beginners to Laravel, but I should clarify what that actually means. I will be assuming that you already know the PHP basics, you can set up local PHP environment, and are comfortable with foundational HTML, CSS, a little bit of JavaScript, and general web development concepts. For this project, we'll be following tasks on Codarc, which, if you don't know, is a platform I put together to break down projects into tasks and guide you through them while keeping you motivated with gamified elements. I want to be very clear though, you don't need to use Codarc or sign up for anything to follow along this video. This video stands completely on its own. Codarc is simply an optional tool that provides structure and breaks down the project into manageable tasks if you find that kind of stuff helpful. Think of it as an optional project management companion and not as a requirement. Now in this video we're going to be building the whole thing, but that doesn't mean that you need to build the entire project in one day as well. You'll notice me skip through some of the tasks for the sake of time, but you should work on it at your own pace, whether that's completing it in a day or spreading it over a few days. By the end of this project, we should have a clean, professional-looking resume web page that loads information from a JSON file, renders it with a responsive layout, and allows visitors to download a PDF version. We will learn core Laravel concepts like the request lifecycle, routing, controllers, views, blade templating, facades, writing tests, and even some performance optimizations with caching. So if you're ready to dive into Laravel and build something practical, let's get started. Alright, so let's skim through the project details in here. As you can see, it is difficulty level 1, which means it's beginner oriented with 25 total tasks. We'll be using Laravel 12 with Blade and Tailwind CSS, and you don't have to use Tailwind if you prefer vanilla CSS or Bootstrap or something else. Feel free to swap out the Tailwind and use whatever you feel comfortable with. Tailwind is not a requirement. The end goal is to build this project. What tools you use to build the project is up to you. These are just recommendations. So the main goals here are to have responsive one-page application that reads and parses either a Markdown or JSON and then renders it. We need to add some social media links like LinkedIn, GitHub. We should be able to generate and download PDF version of the resume and implement basic caching. The very first task in here, as you can see, is the research type task that basically is all about reviewing the project, understanding the scope, picking the tech and strategy that we're going to be using to build this project, and so on. I'll be using the JSON to render the resume because I think it will offer more flexibility than rendering a full Markdown page. If you were rendering a resume within your portfolio website as a separate page or within a section, then yeah, I think it would make sense to use Markdown there. But if it's a single page site that only renders the resume like this one, I think it makes sense to have a bit more structure and control, which JSON format provides. Alright, so before we do any of the setup or any of the coding, let's figure out the resume structure. As I mentioned, I want to use the JSON structure, but what structure should our JSON file follow? Notice that before I even write a single line of code, I'm doing a bit of planning and thinking about structures and making these kind of decisions. And you will notice that as you gain more experience in programming, you tend to do less coding up front and more thinking and more planning instead. And that's what this research task kind of tries to get you familiar with and used to it so that you're not jumping into code right away. Instead, you're kind of zooming out and planning ahead. So what we're going to do here is that we're going to Google, or you can use ChatGPT if you wanted to find out what the best JSON structure for storing resume details is. The first website that comes up in here is called jasonresume.org. And seems like it's a JSON schema for resume details. It also looks like it's open source, and it's based on some sort of standards. So, I mean, it doesn't get any easier or better than that, right? We can just click into it and follow that same schema. As you can see, we have some basic structure here that contains the name, email, phone, the location, profiles, etc. We have some work, volunteer, education related items. We have awards, certificates, publications, skills, languages, and so on. So it contains all the necessary information that we may need for a resume. Now, this doesn't mean that we're gonna use every single property in here in this JSON schema. We're just going to trim this down and use whatever we need for our purposes. And I would encourage you to do the same. You may not want to display things like phone or some other details. You can remove those and just keep whatever you need. But at least we have some structure to go off of and start our project. We don't have to start from scratch. Alright, so now that we know the JSON structure, schema, and the standard that we're going to follow, the next step is to get set up with a fresh Laravel application. You can head over to Laravel's documentation and follow the installation guide there. There are multiple ways to get Laravel set up and running, and it is up to you which one you choose. I'll be using Laravel Sail on my Windows machine in this video. Laravel Sail is Laravel's official Docker-powered development environment. It ships a pre-configured stack with PHP, MySQL, Redis, and so on. And it lets you run everything with a single command, so your app behaves the same on any OS. I want to mention that you don't have to use Sail or Docker. There are many other ways that you can get Laravel installed. You can head over to documentation and pick one of the methods that you prefer. It's part of the research task that you would need to do anyways on your own. Now let's paste in the curl command here to basically pull the Laravel within the folder called example app. That's the name of the project. We're going to rename it and call it something like single page digital resume. So let's hit enter, and this might take a moment to download everything. And once it is done, we can cd into the directory and run vendor bin sail up command, which essentially runs the Docker Compose app behind the scenes. So we can do cd single page digital resume and vendor bin sail up -d so that it runs in the background. Hit enter, and we can see that the containers have been started. Now I'm going to close this and open the project in an IDE. Now I use PHP Storm, which is a paid IDE, but you can use any code editor that you like. You can use VS Code or something else. We can open the browser, type localhost, and as you can see, we get the default welcome page. The first thing that I'm going to do here is that I'm going to change the session driver in the env file from database to file. So we'll open the .env file in here. We'll go to session driver and we'll change this to file. The reason behind this is that we're not going to be using database for this project, and we don't need to run migrations or anything like that. And we're not really managing sessions, so no need to have it set to database. Now don't get overwhelmed with a bunch of folders and directory structure in here. App directory is where most of your application specific code will go to, like controllers, models, etc. Views are stored within the resources views directory, and the routes are within the routes directory. Alright, so before we continue, let's switch to CodeArk, and I'm actually going to enroll in this project. And we're going to complete the research task because we already did that. And I'm gonna complete the setup Laravel project as well because we set up the Laravel 12. The project is running successfully. We can open localhost. The default welcome page is visible, and we understand the project directory structure. You can do more in-depth research on what different folders mean in Laravel, but you'll get familiar with them as the time goes on and as you start working on more features. Alright, so I'm going to skip the Git repository part since I already have the Git set up for this, but I encourage you to go ahead and do this on your own. And the next step, which is to research the data storage format, whether we're gonna do the Markdown or JSON, we already did that research, and we decided that we're gonna do the JSON structure. So I'm going to complete that as well, and we also know which format we're going to follow. The location for storing the data file, we're going to store them under the storage directory. So actually, let's uncheck that and go back to the code, and let's figure out where we're actually going to store it. Let's first try to store it within the storage app private directory. So let's create a new file here called resume.json, paste in the JSON structure that we got from the website. And from here, you can remove what you don't need and update it with your own information. I'm going to leave with the placeholders for now. The next thing that I want to do is I want to create a controller and connect it to a route so that we can read this file and then print it on screen to make sure that it works. Routes, as I mentioned, are stored within the routes directory. As you can see, we have two files here, console.php and web.php. Web.php is the one that contains the web routes, and the console.php is the one that contains command definitions, which kind of act like routes for your console commands. Let me quickly explain Laravel's request lifecycle and some important concepts because I think it's important if you're new to it. When a web request hits a Laravel application, it enters through public index.php, which first aborts if the app is in maintenance mode, then loads Composer's autoloader, and finally boots the framework via this bootstrap app.php file. That creates the application object, which also is the service container. Service container is basically a powerful dependency injection container that knows how to build and share classes your code will ask for. Control then passes to the HTTP kernel, whose bootstrappers configure things like logging and error handling and load a list of service providers. Service providers are modular setup classes that register stuff in the service container in their register method, and then boot features such as the database, queue, validation system, and so on so that the rest of the app can use them. Next, the kernel runs the request through the middleware pipeline, where the middlewares are like gatekeepers that can inspect or mutate the request as well as the response, either globally or for the specific routes or route groups. After the middleware layer, the router matches the URI to a closure or controller method, executes your business logic, and then returns a response. That response flows back out through the same middleware stack, the kernel finalizes it, and pushes it to the browser. Console commands follow a parallel route via the artisan entry file and the console kernel class. It skips the HTTP specific routing, but it shares the same bootstrapping and service provider magic. Now, in addition to being able to define closure-based routes, we can also define controller-based routes. Artisan, which is Laravel's command line interface, offers a built-in console command to scaffold controller classes. There are plenty of other useful commands bundled with Laravel, and you can create your own as well. You can run artisan list command to list all the available commands. If you're using Sail like me, then you can run it through the Docker container. So we can do vendor bin sail artisan list. And this is going to give us list of available artisan commands. And as you can see, there are plenty. And the one that we need is make controller. Now we can either run vendor bin sail artisan make controller, or we can simply run vendor bin sail shell to connect to the Docker container and then run php artisan make controller, followed by the controller name to generate this controller. We're going to call it resume controller. Then let's open the resume controller, which is in here. And let's create a method called index, which should return the blade view for our resume. So we're going to do return view resume. View is a helper function that is available in Laravel that basically returns the view object, and then Laravel handles the rendering of that view. And this here may seem familiar if you know what MVC pattern is. Remember, Laravel at a high level still follows the model view controller pattern, though it's enhanced with additional layers and features. So you have models, which we're not going to be using in this project, controllers, and views. The typical flow is routes funnel a request through middleware to a controller. The controller may validate the input and then talk to eloquent models and then prepare the data and pass it to view or a JSON response. Alright, so next let's connect this controller method to a route. So we go to the web.php, and instead of rendering the welcome page, we're going to call the index method on the resume controller. We can do that by passing an array with two elements. The first one will be the fully qualified class name of the controller, and then second is the method name that we want to execute, in this case, index. We're going to create a Blade template for the resume view. So we'll open the resources directory here, and within views, we'll create a new file called resume.blade.php. Within here, let's paste in the basic HTML skeleton, and within the title, we can call this resume, and in body, we can simply do hello world. Now, Blade is Laravel's templating engine that lets you sprinkle useful directives like if, for each, and components into plain HTML. It makes views clean, reusable, and easy to extend, and you can also execute the PHP code within the Blade templates using the PHP directive as needed. So now let's open the localhost, refresh the page, and sure enough, we see hello world. Alright, so the next thing that we need to do is that we need to pull the resume JSON via the Laravel's Filesystem layer and then dump it into the controller so that we can test if it works or not. Laravel's Filesystem settings lives within the config directory, so if we open the config directory here, we see a bunch of configuration files. And there are more that live within the vendor directory for the Laravel framework, and you can publish them if needed and customized, but these are the ones that come by default. Within here, we see the filesystems.php, and this is basically the file system layer that Laravel offers, and we can configure a few things. Laravel offers multiple drivers that you can use to control where the files are coming from or where the files are going to. By default, as you can see, it's using the local disk, which is local to your Laravel installation, and it can be customized by using this environment variable. If we scroll down, we see that we have multiple disks here, and we have the local disk here, which uses the local driver, and this is the root basically where it needs to load the files from and to, and it's set to app private. We also have the public disk, the S3 disk, which uses the S3 driver, and you can add your own disks as needed. Now we can use the storage facade to interact with the file system. So we can do something like storage from Illuminate support facades, and then call something like get method to get the file from the appropriate disk. Now, as I mentioned, the default disk is set to local, so if we do storage get and then do resume.json, this is going to work because it's going to look for resume.json within the storage app private directory because that's what the local disk is set to. However, if you wanted to pull this file from an S3 bucket, then you would do something like storage disk S3 and then get the resume JSON from configured S3 disk, and you would set up the bucket and everything like that within this configuration in here. Now, I mentioned the word facade. So what is a facade? Facade is a static looking alias that simply forwards your calls to the real file system service that is already registered in the container. They're not static methods, they're just proxies. It uses PHP's magic call static method to call the underlying method on the registered service. So you may think that this is actually a static method. It is not. If we click on this, we see that it's just a PHP doc in here, and the class itself extends the facade, and it has this method called getFacadeAccessor, which returns file system, and file system is registered in a container to the actual file system service class that returns the proper object, and then proxies the static calls that you make, like disk or get, to the actual object that is resolved by the service container. If you look carefully here with the documentation, it actually tells you which service that is. So the file system manager is that class that our calls are proxied to. So if we open this and search for disk, we see this is the method that gets called when we call the disk method here. And as you can see, it is not a static method. If you prefer, you can skip the facade altogether and just type hint the file system contract and let Laravel's dependency injection hand you the same service. I lean on dependency injection most of the time, yet a few facades like the storage, view, route, and cache are handy for quick and readable calls. The rule of thumb here is to use facades sparingly when they truly make the code cleaner and resist scattering them everywhere. If you notice, the web routes file here uses the facade. The route here is the facade. And the get method is not the static get method that exists on the route facade, it's the get method that exists on the underlying class that is registered in the service container. If we inspect this, we see that the get facade accessor returns the router, and this is basically registered in the service container to resolve the proper router object. In the resume controller, we're also using the view helper. And if you don't want to use the view helper, we can do something like view make, and this is going to do the same thing. So let's import this facade, and the make method will essentially do the same thing as the view helper. So if we inspect the view helper function here, we see that it's resolving the view factory from the container. This is how you can resolve classes from the container, and then it calls the make method on that class. This facade here that calls the make method does basically the same thing. If we inspect the view facade, we see that it has the string view as the facade accessor, and this is registered in a container to resolve this factory class. And if we search the make method here, we see that it exists, and this is the make method that gets called whether you call from the facade or you call from the helper function. Now, instead of doing this, you could also simply just inject the factory contract of the view like this and call the make method directly, and it's going to work the same way. Now, if I comment this out and open the browser and refresh the page, we see that it still works. And that's where Laravel's service container comes in handy. It is able to auto-resolve these classes. As you can see, this is an interface, it's a contract, and it's resolving the underlying class that implements this contract properly. The way that works is that there is that implementation class that gets registered in the container to be resolved whenever we request this contract. And that's how essentially everything in Laravel works. Laravel's service container will auto-resolve the dependencies that are injected either in the method like this, where Laravel allows method injection in certain places like the controllers, and it will also auto-resolve the dependencies in constructors. You can also resolve the dependencies using the app helper function, which as you saw in the view helper function, it was using the app function. And you can pass the fully qualified class name in here, and it's going to resolve that for you. You can also pass the alias representation, like a string, in this case view, and it's going to resolve as well. So if we die and dump the app view here and open the browser and refresh the page, we see that it's resolving it properly. So there are multiple ways you can resolve dependencies from the container. I personally don't like to resolve dependencies this way because I prefer dependency injection. So I either inject them in the constructor or in the method if Laravel allows it. Otherwise, if I really need to, I will reach for the app helper function. Alright, so let's load the resume now. So I'm going to get rid of the disk here and call get because we're using the local disk by default. So let's do resume equals this, and then simply die and dump resume for now. Let's open the browser, refresh the page, and sure enough, we see that we're getting the JSON structure. Now there is a problem with us storing these files within the private directory. As you can see, we have this git ignore in here, so technically any file that we put in here are going to be ignored from being committed to a repository. And we may want to commit this to a repository so that we can keep it version controlled and we can make updates to it. Maybe we want to have multiple versions of the resume and so on. Now we could either add this file as an exclusion in our git ignore so we can commit it, or we can move it elsewhere. I kind of want to show you how we could create custom disks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this into a new directory called resumes. So we're going to create a new directory within the storage directory called resumes, and we're going to move the resume JSON in here. Now we can create a new disk in our file system configuration. So I'm just going to duplicate this local disk and call this resumes. The driver can remain local, and then storage path instead of app private will just be resumes. Now if we go to the controller, we'll do storage disk resumes get resume JSON, and that should work. So let's go to the browser, and sure enough, it still works. Now I do want to mention that if you wanted to control some of these values via the environment variables, you could do that, and then you could use the env helper function like in here to load those values. I do want to mention that you should only use the env helper function inside the config files. Anywhere else in your code base, you should fetch the environment-driven settings using the config helper function or the config facade. So for example, if we wanted to pull the S3 URL, instead of using env AWS URL in our controller or anywhere else in the code, we would use the config helper function or the config facade to pull this S3 URL property. So we would do something like dd config file systems disks S3 URL, and then go to browser, refresh the page, and it is set to null because we haven't set that. But this is how you would get that value. Let's say we wanted to get something else that maybe is set, like app URL. So let's do public URL. Let's refresh the page, and sure enough, we see that it works. And the reason why you shouldn't use the env helper function outside of the config files is because Laravel lets you cache configuration along with routes and other stuff for improved performance. Once the configs are cached, Laravel stops loading and reading the env file on each request. So env helper function outside of the config file can return null even if you set the value. Configs can be cached via phpartisan config cache command. So you could run something like phpartisan config cache, and this is going to cache your configuration. And then you can clear them by running config clear. And running the config cache during your deployment process or deployment steps is important because it will give your application a performance boost. Alright, so going back to this, we should JSON decode this and pass it to the view. So we'll do something like resume data, JSON decode resume, and pass it in here. Then in our resume blade template, let's access the name property of the resume. We can do that by using the double curly braces format, and within here we have access to the data that's passed into the view, so we could do resume basics name. Now, this double curly braces format also escapes the data before rendering to protect us from cross-site scripting or XSS. Now, let's refresh the page to make sure that this works, and sure enough, it does. Great, now this is good and we can start building the UI from this, but I personally don't like accessing magical array keys like this. I prefer a bit more structured data access by using data objects or DTOs. This JSON schema here has multiple objects that we can extract into data object classes. Like basics can be its own object, the location can be an object, profiles is list of objects, same goes with the work, and so on. So let's create DTOs for each of those. So first we're going to create the profile DTO because I think that's the simplest one. So let's just create that one for now. We'll create a new directory here called data objects, or you can call them DTOs or whatever you prefer. And within here, we'll create a new class called profile. Now we're going to make this a read-only class, and let's create the constructor here. And as you can see, the Copilot is auto-completing this into a user profile, which probably is not what we want. So maybe the profile is not the right name for it. Let's rename this to something like social profile or social link, because that's what this profile refers to, right? We have the network username and the URL. We'll have the user profile that will contain the rest of the things. So let's name this social profile. And let's create the constructor. And we don't need all of these properties. The ones that we need are network, username, and URL. So let's rename this to network. Let's duplicate it and call this username. And we can get rid of these three. Now we can set all three to blank by default because these are kind of optional fields. Then let's also create a public static method here to create this object from an array. So we could do a public function from array. We pass the data to it, and it's going to return a new social profile object. Now this looks good, but I'm a bit lazy to continue and create every single DTO object. So instead of creating all the data objects by hand one by one, I'm going to use Cursor to generate the data object classes for me. Cursor is an AI-powered code editor forked from Visual Studio Code. It's like enhanced Copilot with basically agentic AI features where you give it a prompt and it has the context of your code base and can generate and write the code for you. It's a huge time saver, so I'm just going to prompt the cursor to help me out with this process. So let me open the cursor here. In the prompt, we're going to type, please generate data object classes for the given resume JSON file. I've already started creating them. You can see an example here at socialprofile.php. If the parameter is a date value, please make it a carbon instance instead of string. Now, what I mean by the carbon instance here is that if we have the date values, I'd like to use carbon, which is the date and time library that Laravel ships with. It's a fluent chainable extension of PHP's datetime class that lets you parse, format, and manipulate timestamps with simple methods. So I'm going to select the Claude for Sonnet as my model, and let's hit enter. Now, while Cursor is cooking here, I want to mention a few things about Cursor. First of all, the Cursor or any other AI tool is not a requirement here. It's just a time saver. Notice that I'm still in the driver's seat. I could probably have this whole project generated by Cursor, but then I wouldn't be in the driver's seat. I'd be vibe coding. I have nothing against vibe coding, but I prefer to be in the lead and have AI follow my lead and assist me to save me time. I want to be able to explain the code it generates and own it as if I wrote it by hand. The moment we lose track of that and can't explain the code it generates, that's when the project becomes painful to maintain and gets out of hand very quickly. I also want to mention that I use Cursor only for its agentic capabilities. I don't use Cursor as an IDE because I'm too used to PHP Storm, and Cursor has other pretty cool features like the autocomplete, just like the Copilot, and so on. But I personally only use the agent mode on it, and then I switch back to PHP Storm to continue coding and editing and all that. Alright, so it seems like it finished, so I'm going to switch back to PHP Storm, and I'm going to review the files that it has generated. So we have the basics in here, and I'm also going to close all the other ones. I do want to open the resume JSON so that I can see the structure on the right side. So the basics, we have the name, label, image, email, phone, URL, summary. The location is an object, which is good. It is creating an empty location object, which is okay. And we have the profiles, which is an array, and it even type hinted it properly here. stating that it's an array of social profile objects. I do prefer another syntax here of like this, but that's something that we can adjust the cursor rules. But for now, that's good enough. Now we do have the from array here. It does check if the location is set, it is doing from array location, and otherwise it's creating an empty location. Now I would have probably done this a little differently. I would have done from array, and if it's not set, just do an empty one, because I'm sure this has checks like this here as well. Speaking of which, let's double check the location. We have address, postal code, city, country code, region, so that's good. And the from array is good as well. So we're gonna do this and replace this way. The same goes in here. It's checking if the profiles is set, and it's checking if it's an array. And if it is, then it loops through and it creates the social profile object from array. And then it creates the basic object properly by passing all the necessary fields. All right, so I think you got that one right. So let's see the certificate. And that one is good. The certificate does contain the date, and it did follow the instructions, right? It is using the Carbon instance. And in here, it's checking if the date is set. It's using Carbon parse to parse the date, and otherwise it's setting to null. So this is pretty good. And I'm pretty sure all the rest of the classes are good. So I'm not gonna spend all that time reviewing in here. I will double check it after the recording. Let's go to a controller now. And since we have the resume data in array format, we can do something like resume from array and pass the entire array this way. And now we're going to pass the resume object to the view instead of an array. Then in our view file, instead of accessing the magical array keys, we can do something like basics name. And maybe let's also render the label. So we'll do resume basics label. Let's go to the browser, refresh the page, and sure enough, it works. Now to enable the autocomplete in PHP Storm, as you can see, these are not clickable. We could type hint the resume variable so that it knows that this resume variable is the resume data object. So we could do something like PHP var app data objects resume and PHP. And this is the PHP directive that allows you to execute PHP code within the Blade templates. And now we're just saying that this resume variable is the resume object, and these things are now clickable. So we can click name and it takes us to the right object. All right, I think we're ready to build the UI. For this, we're going to be using Tailwind CSS and Vite, which come installed by default in Laravel. Tailwind CSS is a utility-first CSS framework that makes styling your apps faster and easier. It lets you style right in your markup by adding classes like P4, for example, to add some padding, or text center to, you guessed it right, center the text. Tailwind is not a requirement for this project. As I mentioned in the beginning, feel free to use any other UI library or framework that you prefer. I just prefer Tailwind because it makes working with UI easier and a bit more fun for me, especially given that I'm not that good when it comes to UIs or designing. Now, Vite is a modern build tool that quickly serves and bundles your front-end assets. Laravel, by default, as I mentioned, comes with both already configured, so you are ready to use them. We just need to add the Vite directive in the Blade template in here. Similar way to how it's done in the Welcome Blade template. So if we open the Welcome Blade template, we see the Vite directive right here. So we can just copy that and paste it in here. This directive automatically detects if you're running the Vite dev server and enables something called hot module replacement, or HMR. So changes show up instantly without refreshing in browser. Within this Vite directive, we're also referencing our assets or entry points for our JavaScript and CSS that are configured in the Vite config file. So here, as you can see, we're loading the app CSS, app.js from the resources directory, And then if we open the Vite config.js, which is in the project root, we see they're configured in here as input. So we have the app.css as our entry point for the CSS, and we have app.js as our entry point to JavaScript. Now we could technically import the CSS directly in the JavaScript, and then we wouldn't need to import CSS in here, which I prefer to do personally. So I'm gonna remove it from here, and instead we'll open app.js. And as you can see, it's importing a bootstrap.js file in here. So we're gonna do import CSS app CSS. This bootstrap.js file basically configures and makes Axios, which is a promise-based HTTP client for JavaScript, available globally. Alright, so now we can run the npm install and then npm run dev for development or npm run build for production. When you run the npm run build for production, it will also properly load the compiled and versioned assets, including those imported CSS. So before we run the npm run dev, I'm going to remove this app CSS from here because we no longer need that. We are referencing CSS directly into JavaScript, and Vite is going to handle all that. So we're gonna run npm install, and then we're gonna run npm run dev. Once it's up and running, we should be able to now make some changes to our blade and see the changes instantly in browser. And we can now start using Tailwind as well. So maybe let's add some gray background to our body. So we'll do class text gray 800 and background gray 50. Open the browser, and as you can see, without me refreshing the page, it already has been applied. Let's adjust the title here. I do want to add the name in the title, so we can do something like resume basics name resume, so that we have the user's name in the title. And let's move that up in here so that we have reference to resume in here as well. And next, let's maybe add the main container here and center it with some kind of maximum width and some padding. So we'll do main class mx auto px4, basically add horizontal padding 4, py10, which is vertical padding, and then max width for XL. And as you can see, I don't have to worry about figuring out the CSS part. This sort of kind of works out of the box because of Tailwind. Go back to the browser, and sure enough, it is applied properly. Now in here, I do want to create a header section. So we'll do header, maybe add some bottom margin, and then we'll do h1 element. Let's make that a slightly larger text. So for Excel, font bold, text gray 900, and this is going to display the name. Then let's add the second level heading and make it slightly smaller. So we'll do text XL, font medium, text blue 600, and margin top 1. And this is going to display the label. So let's get rid of this. Let's see in the browser, and sure enough, that works. Next, let's add some contact info. We can wrap them in a flex container so that it's positioned properly. And we can use if directive in Blade to only show the content if email is set and not empty. So we can do something like div class empty for flex with maybe some kind of gap in between them, and then text gray 700. And here we'll do if resume basics email is set, then we'll create some kind of div in here and put this anchor element within it. The class is going to be hover text blue 600 and margin right 4, so we have some spacing. And let's display the resume basic email, close the tag, close the div, and then close if directive. Now let's do the same thing for the location, but for location we have city and region. So we're gonna duplicate this. Here we can check if the location city is given, and we also need the region to be given for us to display this together. So we will do resume basics location city, and then location region. Now, once we have that, let's also add some social links so that we can display things like LinkedIn URL, maybe Twitter, and so on. Let me actually close this div container in here, and we can add the social links in here. So we'll do the same thing here. We'll check if the resume basics profiles is given. We're going to render them in some kind of div container with maybe some top margin. It will also be flex, and we do want to wrap. And then we'll add gap 3 to have some gap in between them. And then we need to use the loop directive here, which is the for each directive, so that we can iterate over the profiles and display link for each profile. So we can do something like for each resume basics profiles, profile, and we technically don't need the div in here, so we can just keep it simple. And we can redirect the user to the URL whenever it's clicked, and then display the network as the message. Now you could display icon if you wanted to and so on, but we're just going to keep it simple for now. Then we need to add some spacing here, so we'll do px3, py 1.5, and let's make sure that background here is set to white, and maybe make it rounded, and add some shadow. Let's make the text a bit smaller, and we can remove the text color and the underline since we don't need that. Let's open the browser, and sure enough, we see it's coming along quite nicely. I do want to move these sections within the header section because I kind of want to have header styled on its own way, and the header is going to contain things like the contact information like email, and then the location, the social profiles, and so on. And then we'll have the other parts of the resume in separate section. All right, so I'm going to speed up the rest of the markup typing so I don't bore you too much. You're of course free to pause here and continue at your own pace and spend as much time as needed perfecting it.
A few moments later.
All right, so I've pasted some of the markup in here, and if we open the browser, we see that we have some basic information in here. We have the work experience, so it's kind of like a card that displays the company, and then if you have more experience, it will just list them in here. We have the section for skills, section for projects, and the footer that shows when it was last updated. Now, I intentionally didn't add all the other things that are in the resume. You can decide that on your own what you want to display on your page. I think these are more than enough to demonstrate this project. Now, one thing that I do want to adjust is this skill level in here that shows master. I want to show some other label in here, something like beginner, intermediate, advanced, or expert. Let's see how that is stored in the DTO. Remember, this DTO was created by Cursor, and I reviewed it, but I don't remember if it's a string or if it decided to create an enum class. If not, it's probably better if we create an enum class for it. So we have the skill and we have level as string. I prefer things like this to be enums, so we'll maybe create an enum class called skill level, and we'll set this to be null by default. And let's create this class. We'll create it within app enums namespace. Let's make this into an enum. This is going to be a string type, and we'll have 4 levels. So we'll have the beginner, intermediate, advanced, and expert. Then when we're creating the skill from an array, we want to be able to create the skill level from string. So we want to have something like skill level from string, and then we pass the value this way, and we need to create this method. So let's add that method, and we're going to use a match expression in here. So we'll say something like, if the skill level is beginner, we set it to beginner. Even if it's like set to junior. If it's intermediate or mid-level, we set it to intermediate. If it's advanced senior, we set it to advanced. And if it's expert master, we set it to expert. That way, regardless of the wording we use in the actual resume JSON, we will be able to get standardized and consistent level for our skills. I also want to provide the proper color for different levels. As you can see, we have this box background color and then the text color. So maybe we can provide that through a method. So we can do something like public function and do color. And we are again going to use the match expression. So if it's beginner, maybe we'll have green 100, text 800. If it's intermediate, we'll use emerald. If it's advanced, we'll use blue. And then if it's expert, we'll use the sky blue color. Let's do the same thing for the title because we want to display the title properly. So we can add that method. And if it's beginner, we'll show beginner this way. If it's intermediate, we'll show intermediate this way, advanced, expert, and then you can customize the title as needed. You may not even need the title method if you have the name that you want to display matching to whatever is here. In this case, it does match, but I don't like to store values this way, so I'm just gonna make them all lowercase. All right, so now going back to the resume where we're displaying the skill, in here, we're going to remove the background and text color and instead do skill level color. And then in here, we'll do skill level title. Go back and sure enough, it works. One other thing that I want to display in the header is the summary. So some like a short paragraph or something like that that we may want to display on our resume. So we can check here if the resume has the summary, we'll display the summary and maybe change the text color to be a slightly lighter gray than what's set on the body as the default. Let's go back to the browser and we have the summary in here. All right, one thing you probably noticed is that we have a lot of duplication here, right? We have a lot of the similar sections, the repeated classes, repeated markup, and so on. And the only thing that's changing dynamically is just the content. There are multiple ways we can dry up this duplication. Laravel Blade allows us to create partial blade files and then use include directive to include the partials in multiple places. We can then pass the dynamic data as needed, like the project information, for example. We can even use layouts and then render our resume within a layout. That way you could swap out layouts as needed. Another way is to use Blade components, which in my opinion is a bit more cleaner approach. The first component that I think we should create is the layout component. And we can use the artisan commands to do that. So we'll go back in here. I'm gonna do vendor bin sail shell to connect to the Docker container. And then we'll do PHP artisan make component layout dash dash view. This is going to create something called an anonymous component. That's what this dash dash view option tells Laravel to do in here. Otherwise, if we create this component without this option, it will create a class-based component where in addition to the Blade template, you also get the PHP class where you have more control over the props that your Blade component or template receives and so on. But we don't need such control and we don't have complicated components, so having an anonymous component is simple and the right way to go in this case. I would also recommend to start with anonymous components and then see if it's enough. So let's create that. As you can see, it created layout blade within the views components. Next, let's extract the layout part from here, which is basically this right here. So let's open layout and let's also move the footer into the layout. So let's take this and put it in here. And then maybe we want to render just the header part, this one, in here. And then we'll put the content in here. And then we also need to render the main content in here. Actually, it probably would make sense to move the footer in here as well. So we have the header, the body content, and then the footer. In our case, we don't need to have the footer to be full width, so it can be within this max width for Excel constraint. All right, so now the way we can render the content dynamically within the header and within the main body in here is that we can use something called slots. Slot is like a placeholder that basically renders the additional content that is passed to the component. We may have more than one slot. So for example, if we go to the resume blade template and we remove all of this, and then we use the layout component, we can use that by prefixing the component label by x dash. So we'll do x dash layout, and then we can place all of this within that layout. So if we go in here and remove all of this and do it this way, anything that's within this component, like all of this markup, is going to be passed in as the default slot. And we can access that using the slot variable. So we can do something like slot, and now all the content of the component, all of these, is going to be rendered in here. Now, I also want to make this title customizable, right? We may want to have different titles wherever we use this layout component. So instead of accessing the resume directly in here, we'll just make the title be customizable and us to be able to pass that from the Blade template that uses this component. So we could do something like title, and then we need to pass the title variable from here. And the way we can do that is by using colon and then set title, which is the name of the variable we want to pass. And here you can execute PHP expressions. So we can do resume basics name resume. Now let's copy this part from here and put it in here so that we can click through these things and have the autocomplete working. And now it should work. So we should be able to access the title. Let me comment this out so that we can see if everything is working. Let's go back. And sure enough, it is working. The only problem is that right now all of this content is being placed into the main container and not in the header. So we have these parts that should be part of the header, but they're being placed outside of the header. That's because, as I mentioned, anything that goes inside will be included in the default slot, which is right here. Now, in addition to the default slot, you could also have named slots. Named slots let us inject extra bits of markup into specific parts without basically hard coding them. So we could do something like header in here, and then we can pass the slot header from the template this way. So in here, we can basically wrap this content within the X slot header this way. Now, if we go back, we see that it's rendering correctly and all that content, the header content, is being rendered in the right place. Now, we seem to be experiencing a flash of unstyled content here. If I refresh the page, you can see the unstyled markup appears first, and then the styling kicks in a moment later. This is happening because I have the CSS loading through JavaScript, so the browser renders the HTML markup first and then loads the JavaScript, which then imports the CSS and applies the style and causes that flashing. Now, I'm used to this approach because I typically build SPA style applications with React and Inertia, where this loading pattern works perfectly fine. But since we're using traditional Blade rendering here, we need to have another entry point to load the CSS in parallel with JavaScript so that we don't have this flashing. So if we go back in here, if you remember, in the Vite configuration, I removed the entry point for CSS. So let's bring that back. And we also need to bring it back in our layout. So we'll put it in here, and we need to remove it from the app.js, the CSS import. Now we will be basically loading the CSS and JavaScript so that we avoid that flashing. And if we go back to the page and keep refreshing, we see that we no longer have that flashing effect. This is honestly just a muscle memory for me since I don't work with Blade very often. So the first thing I usually immediately do is I remove that 2 entry points and I replace it with a single entry point. But since this is traditional Blade application, we do need this CSS entry point. Now, as you can imagine, you can extract and create more components out of this whole markup. This way you can have multiple layouts and then swap them out as needed without changing a lot of the markup. Now, I'm not going to do that by hand right now to save some time, but you could use AI tools that can do this really well. We could hop back over to Cursor and then ask it to extract some components from all of this. And then we can also ask Cursor to iterate on the design, colors, maybe add some icons, and so on. Right now, our design is pretty bland, right? It doesn't really have anything special. But if you're like me who's not that good at design, we can use AI tools in our advantage to fill in those gaps. And I'm going to use Cursor behind the scenes to design this page a bit better and then have the final version in the repository available for you to download. You can try to do the same or you can design it the way you want by hand. I'm going to have Cursor do some of the tedious work and do some polishing behind the scenes while we talk about something more important like caching. Laravel's caching system provides a unified API across various cache backends. Just like the file system layer, caching also provides multiple driver support. And you guessed it right, the configuration for cache is stored within the cache.php under the config directory. So if we go in here, you see that we have cache.php in here. Let's open that up, and as you can see, the default cache store is set to database, but you could customize it with this environment variable. And then we have multiple stores here. We have the array with the driver array, we have the database, we have the file driver, we have memcached, we have Redis, and so on. Now, looking at our controller code, we are reading and parsing a JSON file on every single request, which isn't a big deal for a personal site with low traffic, but this is a perfect candidate for caching. For a simple resume site, the file driver would be completely sufficient because I think Redis would be overkill unless you're expecting thousands of concurrent users. So let's modify our controller and use the cache facade. So we can do something like resume equals cache, and then we'll call remember and maybe set the key to resume data, and we'll store it for a day, and we'll pass the closure as the third argument, which basically returns the data. So we'll do a function, and within this block, we are going to put all of this in here and do return resume data. We can also take this and return it this way, and we can pass the resume object directly. Now, what this does is that it says, try to get the resume object from the cache using the resume data as the key. If it exists, return that. If it doesn't exist, then execute this code block right here to get the proper resume object and then cache that in memory or file or database or Redis, whatever the driver is set to, for 1 day or 24 hours. So essentially, we only read the file once per day if cached, which is good enough for a resume that doesn't change often. Now, if you do update your JSON file, you'll need to clear the cache, and you could do that by executing phpartisan cache clear command. You could add that as part of your deployment steps so that when you make a change, push to your repo, and then deploy it, it automatically clears the cache so that the new resume is loaded. You could also just create a custom command that is more targeted and only clears the resume data cache and nothing else, so that way you don't have to run phpartisan cache clear. You can just run your custom commands to only clear this cache. Do note that artisan cache clear command clears the default store cache. Speaking of which, we need to update the env file, our environment variable, and change the default store to file. Because in here, the default store is set to database. So let's copy this, find it in the env file, and we'll change the Redis to file. For a small application like this, the file driver provides a pretty good balance for simplicity and performance, and Redis becomes more valuable when you need to share cache between multiple servers or have some complex caching needs. Now, another important note about caching in general is that you shouldn't feel the need to cache everything. A common mistake that developers often make is implementing caching everywhere without first measuring the performance. For our resume example, it's obvious that rendering and parsing a file on every request is inefficient even though we don't have a high traffic website. But for many other operations, the benefits might be negligible or even counterproductive. The right approach is to build your application first, measure the performance, identify the bottlenecks, and then strategically apply caching wherever it makes the most difference and where it makes sense. Premature optimization leads to more complex code oftentimes that is harder to maintain. So I would advise you to always ask yourself, is this actually a performance problem before reaching for the cache? All right, so behind the scenes, I did prompt Cursor to polish up our design, and also I asked it to replace the content in our resume JSON with some placeholder data so that we have a bit more detailed resume. So let's go ahead and check it out, and let's also see how the caching works. So what I'm going to do in here is that I'm going to dump hit so that we see in the browser if we hit this, and then we can see that it should not print hit after we refresh the page, because then it should be getting the data from the cache. So let's go to the browser. As you can see, the page has been updated with a more modern design. We have a resume for John Wick with some social profile links, an image. We have the About Me section, work experiences, some skills and expertise, featured projects, and so on. And as I mentioned before, you could add more information from the resume JSON file if you wanted to. We also added this download PDF button, which doesn't do anything at this time, but that's something that we're going to implement next. Now, if we refresh the page, we see that the hit is printed right here, which means that the resume was not available in the cache, so it executed that closure and it cached it. Now, if I refresh again, we see that we are not getting that printout, which means that it's getting the data from the cache. So I would say that as far as the design goes, Cursor did a pretty good job. Now, if you're following along on CodeArc, make sure that you complete relevant tasks as you go through them. I may not always complete them on my end in the recording because I'm building it in one shot, but when you're building it yourself and you're done for the day, just head on over there and complete the tasks that you did for that day. That way you're kind of keeping track of which tasks you complete and what to work on next when you do come back to continue on your project. All right, so now let's tackle the PDF export feature. A simple approach for PDF generation is to use a popular DOM PDF package for Laravel called Laravel DOM PDF. It's basically a wrapper around the DOM PDF package. So we could install that using Composer. And before I forget, if you do make changes to the resume, right? If I open the resume JSON and scroll all the way up, and let's say we change the name to something like this, and we go back to the browser, we refresh the page, we see that it's not getting updated. That's because it's cached. So in that case, we can run PHP artisan cache clear to clear the cache, go back, and we see that now it's there. So let's revert that back, clear the cache again, go back, and it's all good. All right, so let's go ahead and install the Composer package for PDF generation. It's going to pull in all the necessary dependencies, and then we need to add a new route to download the PDF, right? So let's add a route to download the PDF. We'll do route post download, and then it's going to be resume controller class download, and we need to go to the controller and add that method in here, download. And in case you're wondering why post instead of get here, that's because we are going to be generating the PDF document. We're not just getting the data from the server, we are generating it and then downloading. So it makes sense to have this as a post request rather than the get request. Now, if you were downloading an existing PDF resume, which you might want to do, and I would suggest that that's probably the better way to do it than creating PDF on the fly, then you would use a GET request because you're simply just downloading an existing file. You would store your PDF resume somewhere in your storage directory, and then when the route is hit, you simply allow the file to be downloaded that way. However, in this case, we're generating the resume, so it makes more sense to have it as the post route. So in here, we do want to get the resume data the same way we're getting it here, right? So we're going to copy this and put it here, and then later we'll extract this into a service class or something. But for now, this is okay because we just want to test it out to make sure it works first. Then once we have the resume data, we could simply load the same view with the same data using the PDF package that we just installed. We can use the PDF facade that comes from this package and call load view method and pass the resume and pass the data to the resume blade. And let's assign this to a PDF variable. And then we'll do return PDF download, and let's set some file name. So we'll do resume basics name resume PDF. Now let's open our component that renders the download button that's called download resume button. And let's change this from being a link to a form button. So we'll do form action, and the action will go to download method post. Now let's replace that with form, and then let's create a button here that is going to be a submit button with the same class that our anchor element had, and close it in here. And I think that should be good enough. Now let's open the resume. Let's click download PDF, and we're getting 419 page expired. That is Laravel's CSRF protection. A cross-site request forgery, or CSRF, can trick a logged-in user's browser into submitting a state-changing post, put, patch, or delete request without the user's consent. And such requests can be things like changing the user's email address, or taking money out of the bank account, or making bank transfers, and so on. Laravel protects us by issuing a unique, unpredictable CSRF token for every session. Each form or an AJAX call then must send that token so that Laravel can verify and decide if it needs to allow the request or deny access. There is a middleware called validate CSRF token or a verify CSRF token that gets loaded and used in default Laravel's web routes, which essentially compares the incoming token to the one that is stored in the session and then rejects the request if they are different. This ensures that only the right user can execute state-changing actions. Now, to send the CSRF token with our post requests, we can use CSRF Blade directive, and that will automatically render a hidden field with the CSRF token in it. There are other ways to send the CSRF token if you're making AJAX requests, for example, and you can read up on all of that in Laravel's documentation that explains it pretty well. Let's download the PDF again, and sure enough, that worked. Now let's save this PDF, let's open it, and as you can see, it is a PDF that contains the content from our page. Now, it does not look pretty. It doesn't look as pretty as this. It's just the text content. And that's one of the limitations of generating PDF using this package. DOM PDF does have the limited CSS support, but you could still make it look a bit better than what it is here. Now you do have few options when it comes to having a better styled PDFs. One, you could create a separate, simpler Blade template specifically for PDF output with basic CSS. AI can really help in that case, like Cursor or ChatGPT, to create a nice looking markup with some basic CSS. Now, another option would be to use Spatty's PDF package, which uses Puppeteer and headless Chrome under the hood to generate PDFs with much better CSS support, including Tailwind. That requires a bit more setup though, but it is a good learning opportunity if you want to dig into it. The package is Spatty's PDF, I believe, Laravel PDF. So it's called Laravel-PDF. and it uses browser shot under the hood, which in turn uses Puppeteer and headless Chrome. There are some pretty cool things that you could do with this package, so you could give it a try and use that instead of using the DOM PDF wrapper that we are using here. Now with the DOM PDF wrapper, you could also have like pre-made PDF and then replace some of the placeholders in there with the content dynamically, and that would work as well. It is really up to you how you want to handle that. Alright, so before we wrap it up, let's talk about testing. Laravel comes with excellent testing tools out of the box. We've got PHP Unit, which is PHP's most popular testing framework, and there is also Pest, which is a newer testing framework built on top of PHP Unit that provides a more elegant syntax, especially if you prefer functional look and have experience with testing frameworks in JavaScript like Jest. Pest is pretty cool and worth checking out, but I personally use PHP Unit, so we'll stick with PHP Unit for this project. Laravel does provide additional tools and helpers that make writing feature, integration, and unit tests much easier. It provides tools to write feature tests where you can simulate HTTP requests to your application, basically acting like a user would. It provides tools to fake certain actions, and so on. To explain the difference between the unit tests and the feature tests, unit tests focus on testing individual methods or functions in isolation, like testing a single method on a class to make sure it returns the expected output. Integration tests check how different parts of your system work together. For example, testing that your controller properly calls a service and that service correctly interacts with the database and so on. Feature tests basically simulate a real user interaction by making HTTP requests and testing entire workflows from start to finish. This ensures that your application works as users expect it to work. So they are kind of like end-to-end tests. In practice, I'd recommend to focus more on feature tests because they test the full flow and also test multiple components that work together. So let's write a simple feature test for our resume controller. Let's open the terminal and we can use an artisan command to generate a feature test. So we'll do php artisan make test resume controller test. This is going to create the new test under the tests feature directory. And if you were creating a unit test, you would use --unit, and that would create a unit test under the unit directory. Now let's open that test, let's get rid of this, and let's create our own feature test. Now I like to follow arrange, act, assert strategy, which is a common way to structure tests for clarity and simplicity. Arrange is where you set up your test data and mock any dependencies, basically preparing everything that is needed for the test. Act is where you perform the actual action that you're testing, like calling a method or making an HTTP request, and assert is where you verify that the expected outcome has occurred, checking that right data was returned, the correct status code was sent, or the proper side effects that happened. So let's do public function test resume page loads successfully. This is not going to return anything, and we're going to do arrange first. So we'll set up some resume data. We're not going to be loading anything from a JSON file here. Instead, we are simply going to be faking the data. So let's just set up some dummy data in our variable here rather than read some kind of file. So I'm just going to paste in some basic data in here. And then we need to basically create the resume JSON file so that when we make the HTTP call, it can find that file and return the data using this data in here. Now, during testing, we don't want to actually read the actual resume JSON file from the resumes directory, and we don't want to place any test files there either. We want to kind of have isolated testing environment where we can put in some files and then remove them after we're done with testing. Instead of doing that manually, Laravel actually has a way to fake the storage so that it places the files in the temporary directory for you and then cleans it up afterwards. The storage facade has the method called fake that essentially allows you to swap the disk that you specify with the throwaway local driver. So we can call the fake method on the storage facade in here, and we want to fake the resumes disk. And then after that, we can simply create the resume JSON file within this fake resumes disk. So we can do storage disk resumes and then call the put method, specify the file name, which is the resume.json, and then pass the content, the JSON encoded resume data that we have in here. Now, what this is going to do is that it is going to create the file in a temporary directory instead of the live resumes disk. And then whenever we call the get method in here, since the storage has been faked, it is now pointing to the throwaway local driver that's pointing to the temporary directory, and it's going to read the resume JSON from the temporary directory and not from the live resumes directory. Next, what we need to do is that we need to make a GET request to our index method in here so that we can assert or confirm the data that's being returned. Now we can act on this and make a GET request to the resume page. As you can see, the Copilot is auto-completing here, and this is correct. So the response equals to this get slash resume. Now in our case, slash resume doesn't exist. It's just the home page. But you can see that there is a helper method called get in here, which is provided by the framework and makes the get HTTP request to the route that you provide. Now, once the response is returned, we need to assert our content. So let's do assert. And the response object that gets returned here has some assert methods that we can use to assert various things. So for example, we can assert the status to be 200. We can assert to see some data since our response in here is a view and not a JSON content. So it returns a Blade template, and we want to confirm that the returned view contains the data that we have in here. So we may want to confirm that the name John Doe is contained in the response. So we can do assert see and the value, which is John Doe. We also want to assert that software developer is part of it, and maybe assert the email is part of it as well. There are different helper methods in here to help you test for different things, but this is good enough for now. So let's run this test, and sure enough, we see that one test with 4 assertions have passed. Now, if we change this to something like John Doe 1, this should fail. And sure enough, it does, and we're getting that this content that was returned by our request does not contain John Doe 1. Now we can run the test in terminal as well. So instead of running it in PHP Storm like I did, we could do PHP Artisan test, and sure enough, we see that tests pass. Now as you can see, it's also executing the example tests that were there before that come with Laravel's default installation, but we can see that it's passing our feature test as well. All right, and then you could also create the feature test for the download method to ensure that the PDF is being generated. Now, we're not going to do that now, but I do want to extract this into a service class so that we can reuse that in multiple places. So let's copy this, let's create the services directory, and let's create the new service in here called resume service, and we're going to have a method that's going to return the resume data. Now, instead of this, we're going to return this from the cache if it's available, and we're going to type hint this to resume data object. Let's format the code, and let's use this resume service in our controller. Now, instead of injecting the resume service in both the index and download, we're going to inject it in the constructor. So we'll do private read-only resume service. Let's import that. And then in here, we can get rid of this and simply do this resume service get resume data. And maybe we can actually call this get resume. Let's rename this to get resume. And let's do the same in here. Let's add some type hints in here. This is returning the response. This is returning the view. And let's get rid of these unused imports. Let's import that. And I think this is looking pretty good. Now, as you can imagine, this would be a good candidate to add maybe unit tests to, so that you can test to ensure that the getResume returns the proper resume object. Alright, so the final step here is to create the README file that explains what this project is about, how to set it up, how to use it, and so on. You also need to prepare for the deployment, since that is one of the tasks in CodeArc. You don't actually have to deploy it for this project unless, of course, you want to. You just need to research the different ways you could deploy this project. You could use DigitalOcean droplets and Laravel Forge to help you provision those droplets and handle the deployments for you by connecting to your GitHub repo. Or you could use some of the other services that are available. We're not going to do that in this video since this is beginner oriented and I don't want to overwhelm you with deployments and things like that. We will do that in another project. Alright, and I think that's it. To sum it up, we've built a complete good-looking digital resume application from scratch using Laravel. Along the way, we've covered core Laravel concepts that you will use in pretty much every Laravel application. So take this away, adjust it to your liking, complete the project, and share the link to your resume so that I can review and others can review as well and provide feedback. Thank you so much for following along. I'll be back with another video where we're going to build another project with a bit more advanced features that involves databases, Eloquent, and so on. So thanks again and happy coding.